Welcome to Season 9 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who believe the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by the one and only Dr. Marco Iacoboni, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA and director of the Kreshik Family Neuromodulation Lab at the Mason Lovelace Brain Mapping Center. His research investigates brain systems and mechanisms for higher cognitive functions, in particular social cognition in health and disease. Marco is also the author of this most outstanding book, Mirroring People, which explores the groundbreaking research of mirror neurons. In other words, the smart cells in our brain that allow us to understand each other. Welcome to the show, Marco.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I like the one and only.
The one and only, the one and only. It's so true because I was saying to you just before we hit record, your work has been instrumental in my Ph.D. research, and the work that you've done on mirror neurons has been important for the world to understand empathy better. And I'm coming to this interview with a sense of butterflies to meet you and have a conversation because you're, a big titan of empathy research. And then our first 5 minutes of conversation, you happen to mention almost in passing when you were in Australia at a conference, on stage with the Dalai Lama and Jane Goodall and Frans de Waal, three of my heroes. I thought, oh my goodness, how lucky am I to get to spend part of my afternoon with you? So thank you for making the time. And I want to start actually with something you wrote at the very end of your book. I believe we are at a point at which findings from neuroscience can significantly influence and change our society and our understanding of ourselves. It's high time we consider this option seriously. Our knowledge of the powerful neurobiological mechanisms underlying human sociality provides an invaluable resource for helping us determine how to reduce violent behavior, increase empathy, and open ourselves to other cultures without forgetting our own. We have evolved to connect deeply with other human beings. Our awareness of this fact can and should bring us even closer to one another. It is, okay, look, I got goosebumps. I don't know if the screen shows it, but yes, and this is like 15 years ago you wrote this. So let's start at a very high level. I mean, you're a scientist, you're studying the neuroscience of empathy and the mirror neurons and what that's all about. And yet you're seeing such significance on a social scale, how we can coexist peacefully. What's happened in your mind over the last 15 years as you've studied mirror neurons to what you think about the world and sort of the importance of empathy nowadays?
That's a great question. It's a high-level question. And I don't know if I actually even mentioned this in the book, but jokingly, I talk about also the dark side of empathy. Unfortunately, there's all this divisiveness, especially in North America, I mean, in the US especially, I'd say, but even in Europe, we've seen some of that. And again, what your passage, the one you read is really perfect because it really focuses on the fact that to empathize with others, we really have to really focus on the similarities. And we're going to have differences, which is fun. I mean, life, variety and differences are important in life. But to really, I mean, one thing that really have to keep in mind is that what really makes us similar is what makes us also the object and the subject of empathy. There is a beautiful quote from one of my favorite guys in the history of mankind, Marcus Aurelius. He wrote, if I'm thinking about myself as Marcus, I think about my city as Rome. But if I think about myself as a human being, then my city is the whole planet. So I think that what's going on is that in the last 15 years, but also, I mean, you've seen some of this science even earlier. The reason why I actually wrote the book is because I thought this is such a great story. I mean, we did research in the lab that tells us that we have evolution selected in our brains systems and mechanisms that are important for empathy, make us empathic, wired for empathy, as one of my chapters is titled. And yet we have also these other aspects that make us drop empathy dramatically. And we really need to focus on what is important. What is important is to really to empathize, to connect with each other, and to support each other, to empathize. And we're not doing it that well recently, which kind of breaks my heart, because I feel that I got to say that when the book came out, I got a lot of emails from readers that say, "Oh, this is incredible. I recognize myself so much. Sometimes at the end of the day, I'm drained because I'm a very empathic person." So there was a lot of positive resonating about the book. I feel that it's a little lost now, maybe because I'm focusing too much on American politics, but also feel that, for instance, we're not doing much about climate change, and that's really a lack of empathy for our future generations. Because, I mean, we're not going to be affected much, but we know that future generations will see dramatic things. So it's really important to focus on empathy and to understand that getting into the predicament of other people, making them better, it's also almost a selfish act because you feel better yourself when you do that. So it's really important, not just for other people, it's also important for you. And those things still stand. I think those are things and concepts that haven't really changed in my mind in the last 15 years, I would say.
Beautiful. And I promise to all the listeners and viewers that we are going to talk about the personal benefits of empathizing. But we have a set of questions that I'm really excited to get through with you. So let's go straight to the beginning. How did you get interested in the first place, investigating the brain mechanisms of empathy? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, that's so serendipitous. I mean, that's one of the big lessons in life, that you end up doing things that you didn't even think of doing. I was really interested in how the brain puts together perception and action. And we do that all the time. I mean, we do it, we try to get out of the house without grasping the doorknob. You need to see the doorknob in order to grasp it and to open the door. And these are very simple, what we call in jargon, perception action coupling. So you put together your perception and your action, and you create this an action that seems so simple and so easy to do, requires a lot of neural machinery to do it well. If you have certain lesions in the brain, you end up finding yourself, it's very difficult to do that very silly action. So the brain is a great machine to do those things. And I was really interested in that because it's basically, we do that all the time. There is no way of getting out of perception action coupling. You need to have a very smooth transition between how you perceive and how you act, and how you predict you're going to respond to the consequences of your own action, those kinds of things. So I started with that. Then serendipitously, I'm in a meeting in Prague. A lot of people think I'm coming from Rizzolatti's lab, but actually I knew the guy because he was already a very famous Italian neuroscientist. I was already in LA and I had never met the guy, but I'm at this meeting and I talk about my own research, and I give a talk, and he, at the coffee break, he comes to me, he says, "Oh, that's really cool stuff you're doing. We got this thing that we just discovered in the monkey, these neurons that fire when the monkey grasps something and when the monkey sees one of us grasping something. And we think this is really important. And we want to study also in humans, and you're doing human work. So we should talk because you do perception action coupling." And I say, "Yeah, let's talk." I mean, he was one of my adults, so I wanted to really work with him. And we came up with, a whole plan. We wrote a grant together. We got funded. Then we started thinking of how to do this project. And because of that, I actually, what I did was to go back and read the paper that they published. So I read this paper again, and I'm thinking, and that's just the night before we meet for the first time after we wrote the grant, we got funded. And I think, is it even possible? I mean, with cells in the motor cortex that fire when the monkey's not even moving. I was skeptical myself. Then I went to the lab, I saw the phenomenon, it was incredible. But the idea was initially was more about, they had some theories about language, and it wasn't really so much about empathy initially. But then they studied also how the monkeys were responding to facial expressions. And I thought, okay, so that's a link to empathy. I also have to publicly acknowledge Celia Hayes. She's a famous British psychologist, and I published this paper. So in my work, when I talked to Rizzolatti and his group about this, okay, but clearly there is one thing that's very important in human behavior, which is imitation. We learn by looking at other people doing things. You learn not only skills, but also how to behave in a given environment. And so I thought, well, so if the monkey has neurons in her brain that fire when the monkey makes the action, when the monkey sees someone else making the action, it seems to me that neural machine is very important for imitation. And so we did study in imitation, still my most successful study, published in Science, a lot of resonance. And then Celia Hayes sends me this paper from two social psychologists in which they're linking imitation with empathy. What I found was that they do this very clever experiment in the lab in which they can film the whole interaction. And one is a confederate, a scientist that pretends to be a participant. The other one is a participant. And they measure the level of imitation that the participant shows. And they can also measure the level of empathy through questionnaires. And they find that the more you tend to imitate other people during a social interaction, the more you tend to be empathic. They call it the chameleon effect. And I thought, okay, but then that means that probably in the brain, these mirror neuron areas must be connected to my emotional brain systems, like the amygdala. And there should be a whole system that leads from watching others doing things to feel what they feel. And we did whole studies on that, and we published that in PNAS, also heavily cited. And so we started the whole work on empathy. And empathy is a complex thing. So basically, the first paper we did on empathy was published in 2003. We were still working on it. We're still working on it because I really want to understand the nuts and bolts. And now we have really cool data that show that even if I look at your resting brain, your brain at rest, and I look at the wiring of different brain regions, I can predict how empathic you tend to be, which is, to me, super amazing. But that's the way I started. I started basically mostly because one thing leads to another in science, and especially things that are successful, that are a nice story. But then I realized empathy is really so important. It's something that, again, I wasn't really thinking too much about it when I started doing the work of mirroring. But then it became really almost my obsession, in the sense that we are often taught the opposite, that we should be selfish beings. And it's such the wrong message, because what's really good for you is to be empathic. It's not just because you're nice to other people, but because it's really good for you to empathize, to resonate emotionally with others.
And I know that you are aware of the evolutionary aspect of it, right? Like our brains evolved to be that way. So it's in service to us now in 2022 as we're taping this, but it's always been in service to us, right? So can you explain what's the theory on why our brains evolved to be empathic?
Yeah, the theory. I think that the theory is like, if you think about more like social interactions, many agents in a social milieu, in a social environment, group behavior is always better than individual behavior. I mean, we live in a very individualistic society, but actually there are many other human societies that are much more collectivistic. And for them, it's totally natural to think, yeah, of course, it makes sense. So I think that one of the driving factors in sort of generating in the brain these mechanisms, and actually they're multi-purpose. It's not just, again, imitation is very important for social interaction, for learning how to do things, new skills. And there's a whole theory about language and imitation and motor theory of speech perception. But clearly, empathy it does have its adaptive value. To empathize with others and to have an empathic society makes the society much stronger. So that's why we should really be concerned about the divisiveness that we see spreading, I would say, all over the world. And people say, well, actually, but in the past, humanity was much crueler than we are now. We tend to be more considerate toward other human beings. That is true overall. But I'm seeing that in the last couple of decades, things have got a little worse compared to the way they were 20 years ago. So it's something, I think that's one of the reasons empathy got selected as an adaptive function.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it did, because I think we could live more harmoniously and be healthier. I think we are social beings, and we're living in a circumstance now where a lot of us are in single dwelling homes. I mean, COVID didn't help, where we were feeling totally socially isolated. Twitter didn't help because you've got, algorithms that allow echo chambers. So you're just hearing the same messaging that you already agree with. So the case for empathy, I believe, has been made, and now we have to figure out how we can really champion it. I want to just stick with another scientific.
A little comment on Twitter?
Yeah.
And not because of the recent acquisition, but I was one of the early scientists that jumped on Twitter. I thought it was a great idea, and for many years I've used it quite a bit. And then I totally dropped using it. It's such a poisonous environment. That is really, I mean, you're right. I mean, basically, it's all social medias. That's what they do. They become, they reinforce your own beliefs. You just talk to the people that think like you. But Twitter in particular, every time I go on Twitter, I realize how poisonous it could be. So I just recently haven't even been on Twitter much. And I think it's, you want to also, I don't know if people find it rewarding to sort of be so antagonistic. I don't find it rewarding at all. I think it's like, I don't feel good about that. So
right. And on both sides of the polarity, it's really, I understand, like, at maximum 15% here and 15% here. So the vast majority of people are not so polarized, and yet they take up so much of the airspace and so much of the political discourse, and that's toxic and not productive and doesn't generate good outcomes for the mass people. Okay, I don't want to give Twitter any more airtime. I want to ask you a question, and there's let me find this page. I'm going to be annoyed with myself if it doesn't come to me quickly. Okay, yes, here we go. So I want to ask about the neural mechanism for empathy, right? You describe it's like 3 little boxes in your book. There's a relationship between mirror neurons, the insula, and the limbic system. And you start that chapter by describing Zidane's infamous headbutt. So do you remember this chapter? Do you know the anecdote? Do you remember?
Of course. Yeah,
okay.
Of course. How can you forget it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember too.
I'm Italian.
Congratulations. Right. Yes. Okay. I was celebrating in Little Italy in Montreal when it happened too, and I still remember the headbutt. But can you describe that, why you use that story for the opening of this chapter, and then actually describe to us the neural mechanism of empathy?
Yeah, I think that's one of those, there are many other examples that one could use. That one, because it was amplified by the fact it was a major football match for a major international competition. And the thing was so dramatic, the guy that really hits the chest of the other guy first of all, how can you even think of doing something like that? Dude, please. Anyway, and Materazzi goes down, like just falls down. And so there's a lot of immediate reaction. That's exactly the kind of emotional contagion, one of the aspects of empathy. Yeah, exactly. So I thought it was a good example. I was writing the book already, and they were re-showing the match because, of course, Italy won, so they were showing the match every other day. And they were showing the match. I was actually with my family. It was summertime. We had 3 generations around the table and watching in the background that thing. And then I see the headbutt, and I'm thinking, that's a good example that I can give to my readers of how you can immediately feel the pain of someone else. by seeing the guy falling down because the head of the other guy hits him in the chest. So it's a very salient action, very famous. That's a good reason to use it, but one could use many others. It doesn't have anything specific in itself. And then, yeah, the idea was that started the whole model. Now it's like way more complex, than that. But initially started in a very simple way. The idea is that, well, you have these areas that seem to be having these mirroring properties. They are acting when you make an action. They are acting when you see someone else making an action. And when you're imitating the action of someone else, they're even becoming more activated.
Mm.
And then we have these other centers that we know are important for emotions. So these are for any kind of action, even very simple actions. And then we know that there are these centers in the brain that are important for emotion. The amygdala is one of the most important ones. Emotions are spread out throughout the brain. It's not that they're just in the amygdala, but the amygdala is a salient center that really maps onto emotional behavior. And I thought, okay, so there must be a way in which my mirror neurons and the amygdala, the emotional brain centers, are talking to each other. And if you look at the anatomy of the brain, an area that connects the two is the insula. And the insula is kind of a little brain inside the brain. And basically, it's it does have connection with a bunch of different areas. Insula means island in Latin because it looks a bit like an island. And it does have a lot of connections. So I wasn't too surprised that it was connecting the amygdala with my mirror neuron areas. On the other hand, we know that the insula is very important for emotion in general by itself. But then I thought, okay, let's make a very simple model. Because that's when you have very little information, you need to start with simple model and you want to test them. That's how science is actually built, step by step. And the little model was that, I see you smiling like you're smiling at me right now. And in my own brain, my mirror neurons for smiling light up. And then they send information through the insula all the way to my amygdala, so that by activating the amygdala, I feel what you're feeling. I feel the emotion. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we started thinking about it. We did a study that supported the model, and then we added on it more and more and more.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. So when I do talks about empathy and I try to explain the difference between affective and cognitive empathy, I usually use two photographs. I have this one picture of a little girl, she's 6 years old or so, and she's smiling, like she's glowing. And I share what I see with the audience, that everybody's got like their cheeks are turning up involuntarily. Yeah. And then the next picture that I show is a child that's in full crying, like just devastating. And, unless you're a psychopath, your facial expressions change. And I explain that that's happening spontaneously to us thanks to our mirror neurons. Am I being technically accurate saying that?
Totally accurate. Plenty of data support that. I mean, I want to say one thing. It's not just when you say that thing, it's as if it's only mirror neurons. Of course, it's not only mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are embedded in a bunch of other nervous tissue that is important. If you didn't have your visual cortex, you wouldn't be able to see the smiling face. So you need to have that. And if you're actually smiling yourself, you also have to have the control of your butt. The mirror neurons seem to be doing something that is very crucial, mapping very easily the percept of someone else smiling and then the motor plan to smile myself. And actually, that's funny because I also in my slides, when I was talking, for many years, I used a slide in which I was showing the model in terms of the brain regions, and then I had to show an emotional and facial expression. And I chose the smiling face because I like positive emotions. Why do we always have to show, negative emotions? I like to show positive ones too.
Great. Okay, I'll see your slide deck. Share it with me. Another question from your book. You write, and this is towards the end. In my lectures on mirror neurons, I often conclude by saying that our research should be called existential neuroscience. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I came out with that term and I love it. I still love it. First of all, I like existence more than essence, just to borrow from Jean-Paul Sartre, famous dictum. I think that's exactly what, the whole point of mirroring is that it's really based on very simple, concrete things, seeing you, smiling, seeing you, interact with you, social interactions. So it really reminds us, because we always tend to think about the brain as this computing machine, very abstract. But a lot of the research we've been doing also maps onto this notion of embodied cognition, that even the more complex and abstract cognitive processes are actually grounded onto our own body. And it seems to me mirror neurons actually embody that perfectly well, not only because of their role in empathy, but for their role in imitation, for their role in language. You actually just really demonstrated that when you're listening to me, and now I'm talking, you're just listening, and yet your motor cells for speaking are silently activating to sort of mimic in your brain what I'm saying. I don't know if you're also mimicking my Italian accent, but you're certainly mimicking the speech sounds I'm using. And we've done studies that show that with brain imaging, and then we've done brain stimulation, which will show if that brain region gets sort of reduced in its activity, then your ability to perceive speech sounds goes down too, even in healthy participants. So that's also, so it's really it's a pervasive mechanism. It's a fairly simple mechanism. As Celia Eyes would suggest, she said, she likes to say, what's the big deal about mirror neurons? After all, it's just associational learning. You see someone, probably starts, and I give this example, the baby smiles, the caregiver is so happy that smiles back. So in the baby's brain, it's very simple to associate the motor plan for smiling with the sight of someone else smiling. And I agree with her. It's mostly association learning, but it's still sort of magical because it's become so pervasive. And the more you do it, the more it reinforces the ability to imitate, to empathize, to become a more competent social agent.
So I have to ask, and this may sound like I'm making an assumption, and maybe I am, but as a scientist who has studied this, how has it informed you as a man, as a human being? How has it changed your relationships? How has it changed your own behavior as a person walking through the world?
I wish I could do better.
I hear you. No, I feel that too.
No, but I'm thinking, yeah, there's an aspect of my personality that kind of almost made me prone to finding these things. I mean, not to finding them, because you need to do experiments, you need to get data that back up, your intuitions or your inspiration from the studies done in the monkey. You can't come up with things that it's in your mind. But I think I like that story because I tend to be like that. I like more like to empathize and to be collegial and to be, friendly rather than be antagonistic. Some people have antagonistic personalities, or they try to be prima donnas. I have to say that you were talking about Dalai Lama and Jay Goddard. I'm actually fundamentally a fairly shy guy. So for me, it was actually even going out there and giving talks to a large number of people. It was a bit challenging, but I enjoyed the process because I think it's also an important thing to do. And how did it change me? It made me think about that. The more you actually, one thing probably I wouldn't have said this thing like 20 years ago, that if you are empathic, it's good for you. It's almost like selfish. But now I'm pretty convinced that that's the case. And I try to, to implement that in my life too. Of course, you fail most times, but I'm hoping that in some cases I succeed.
Because one of the questions that I wanted to return to that I said to the audience I would is a question: is empathy good for the empathizer? So is there real science that shows that? I mean, besides you anecdotally believing so?
Okay, so there are two aspects of it. We feel that there is an optimal range of empathy. You don't want to have too little, but you don't want to have too much, because if you have too much and you cannot control it, then you really end up being drained at the end of the day because you feel all the emotions of other people. And also, it wouldn't be too adaptive. I mean, say that I'm walking on campus and you're visiting beautiful UCLA campus and you rented a bike, and I see you falling from the bike and I see you that you're in pain. If I feel your pain, but I'm so that pain that I'm feeling, vicarious pain that I'm feeling, it's so overwhelming that I cannot even help you. That's not going to help you either. it's not adaptive. So you really have to, at some point, you need to have some corneal control that suppresses that vicarious pain and makes you becoming more pro-social and really active and helping you rather than just watching you. Oh man, that's more like personal distress. You don't want to be too, a hostage of your personal distress. You want to try to really have empathic concern, which means that, yeah, you feel the pain of other people, but then you try to help them, which also requires putting yourself together. So I think that these are the important things that we need to remind and ourselves about empathy. And so I think it's the kind of study I've been thinking more and more. And now we're doing these super cool studies in which we actually show that if you look at cognitive areas, not your classical mirror, because that the other thing about empathy is that, well, but there are two main kinds of empathy. There's the emotional empathy, but then there's the cognitive empathy. Thinking about what's going on in your mind. What's going on in Anita's mind that, invited this crazy Italian scientist to her podcast, and what is she thinking now? I have to use more like my cognitive apparatus to think about how you're thinking. And people and I can actually see why that happens. It's very easy to teach by dissecting things. So you want to sort of separate, cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. It's a great way to teach these two different forms of empathy, and we have those. But then what's going on under the hood in the brain? Because at the end of the day, it's the brain that determines how we empathize with others. And people took this division of labor between cognitive and emotional empathy a little bit too literally. And they were thinking about these two different systems, that they're very separated. And I thought, yeah, but really separated? I always tend to be inspired by evolution. And I thought, well, really emotional empathy probably came online first. And then on top of that, we built cognitive empathy. So that means that probably there is some connections between the two. And so we started studying those connections. And what we found was that indeed, the connections within your cognitive areas and your emotional areas that are important for empathy are so important that are also at play when you seem to be doing only one of those two things. So say I see you falling from a bike, and I see your pain, and I feel your pain, that's emotional empathy, emotional contagion. Or say I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, what's going on in Anita's mind now that she's doing this podcast with me, which is more like cognitive empathy. Mm-hmm. These two states, these two examples seem to be very, very different. It feels like you only need one part of your brain for one thing and another part for the other thing. Well, we demonstrated that you need both. It's a complex experiment. And that led us also to think, well, maybe it's really the connection between these two sets of areas that are really important to determine your overall level of empathy. And we even demonstrated that, showing that even in your brain at rest can tell me how empathic you tend to be just by looking at the connections between cognitive areas and emotional areas.
So if I came to visit sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, that means that I come to your lab, I could go into one of your machines and you could tell me, you could predict how empathic I am?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but we actually use we scan a lot of people, then we use machine learning. We teach the machine, okay, this person has this level of wiring in the brain between this region, and this is the level of empathy. So the machine learns patterns. Then we feed the machine with a completely different set of people. And the machine needs to predict the level of empathy just by looking at the wiring. And it does. It does it. So it really shows that our wiring in the brain between these two large sets of areas that are important for emotion and for cognition are really what shape the way we are in terms of being empathic agents or not empathic agents.
Mm-hmm. So I remember when I first came across the neuroscience of empathy, and obviously your work, and like you said, out of Parma, the Rizzolati's research, the affect empathy. And then I also started to learn a little bit more about neuroplasticity. And for me, there was a lot of hope when you learn that the brain can change itself, right? You can choose to think more empathic thoughts, you can behave in more empathic ways, and you can rewire your brain. So I don't know if you ever get asked this or how often, or if you have an answer that you like to share, but what advice would you give to anybody who wants to become more empathic?
Oh yeah, I mean, advice. I'll tell you one thing. Certainly, you can become more empathic. It's pretty much like you want to be a good tennis player. You're gonna have to play tennis, get a good coach, and start playing tennis. And if you want to really improve your level of tennis, you need to dedicate time. But I think that pretty much anything we do or we think we are empathic or not empathic. Yeah, a lot of it is reinforced. If you tend to be an empathic person, you navigate your social environment and you show empathy, and that reflects back on you. If you tend to be not very empathic, a little cold as an individual, people will be cold with you too. So there's a lot of reinforcement. And so we tend to think, oh, this is the way I am. No, this is the way you shape your life, but you can actually change it. And we have plenty of evidence. When I went to med school, which is many, many years ago, I was told, you hit 25, you're going to just lose brain cells. Now we know that's totally untrue. You can not only regenerate brain cells, but also the connections between brain cells can always be reshaped. So clearly you can, if you want to, you can clearly become way more empathic. How to do it? That's a more complicated thing. I mean, certainly you can go through treatment or therapy to become more empathic. And that's, in some cases, it's done for clinical reasons. I mean, some people really lack empathy, and that's really not good for their mental health. So it is done also clinically. We are also thinking we could use brain stimulation to sort of jumpstart improving empathy in individuals and shaping that through brain stimulation. But then you still need to reinforce it. You can't just, have a change in your wiring with brain stimulation and that's it. You still have to go out in the world and exercise your empathy, both as an empathic agent and as the empathizer and the people that is empathized to.
Mm-hmm. Two questions left. Penultimate question. You've been so generous, Marco. This has been so wonderful, really. I'm curious to know if your lab or any of your colleagues are thinking about the potential of psychedelics, because it's in a renaissance right now, for a lot of reasons, treating PTSD and depression and even addictions, but also just by virtue of consciousness, through the experience of psychedelics, of feeling like connected to people and a sense of belonging. And I wonder whether or not if you're intrigued by that, or if you're looking at that at all.
I'm not looking at it at all, and I'm actually, as an observer, I'm seeing there is more and more research on psychedelics the last few years, and it is really growing quite a bit as a field. I'm not an expert on it, and we're doing our own things. It's not something that I've considered doing right now because I'm busy I'm trying to do more like incremental science and build on my own previous research. But now that you mention it, I'm thinking, why not? Maybe I should do some of that research.
Okay, well then another interview in a few years to figure that out. Okay, last question, Marco. I love asking my guests. It's a personal question. If they could share a time in their life when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you, would you have a story that you'd like to share?
Well, actually, I probably gave away my own example. It's not my own experience. I guess maybe because I'm a lucky guy, I've never felt much to be, not because I don't trigger empathy in other people, but just because I guess people don't feel that they do to show empathy to me because I'm pretty, healthy and lucky. I can say that whenever I have a little, I mentioned tennis, whenever I have a little injury that makes me stop playing tennis. All my tennis buddies are very, very empathic about that. I don't have a dramatic example of it. I can go back to the very beginning when I gave the example of Marcus Aurelius. That's a beautiful example on how I can actually think about empathy. That you can actually you reframe things, or in jargon, it's called cognitive reframing, basically. You think about yourself as a Roman dude, and then you think about your city as Rome, which is a beautiful city, by the way. But then you think about yourself as a human being, and then you think about your city as the whole planet. That means everybody on the planet is also your, people that live in your own city are like you. So it's, in that regard, it's such a beautiful example. But real life example, in my case, I have to say, I can't come up with really anything in particular. Maybe just because.
No, but ending with a Marcus Aurelius quote, from a Roman to a Roman, sounds perfect. And I love asking this question because I never know the answer that I'm going to get. But I think what you're leaving me and maybe the readers or listeners and viewers with is, we have this capacity to empathize. It's been part of our evolutionary success as a species, and we need to practice it. We need to, extend our empathic capacities beyond our inner circle, our in-group, to all of mankind. As you intonated, as you suggested, climate change is going to impact our progeny for generations to come, and we should care more about that.
Yeah, no, totally. And the other thing I want to say is that rather than thinking about dramatic example in which empathy can be embodied, which are also important because they capture the imagination of people, I also think a lot about empathy in terms of the little gestures, the little everyday gestures, the little hug, the smile, those kinds of things that we can do over and over again to the people that we interact with.
Love it. Love it. Thank you for the gift of your time and the research that you've contributed to the world, so that we know for sure that our capacity to empathize is present with us and should be exercised.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about these things.
Bye, Marco. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free of your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.ca and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.